In 1994, Stargate started one of the biggest science fiction franchises most people have never heard of. What does it feel like to go back to the beginning in 2024 and see the movie for the first time? Let's talk about Stargate.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Eye of the Storm podcast. Daniel, do you want to let the people know what we're doing today?
So this is Have You Seen, in which we talk about a movie that some of us know well and others have just seen for the first time. This week, we're talking about Stargate from 1994, which is a science fiction movie by Roland Emmerich about a device that is found in the desert of Egypt that turns out to be a portal to another world. And when an archaeologist figures out how to turn it on, an expedition goes through the gate to another planet and then encounters something straight out of mythology. So I've seen Stargate a bunch of times, and it's one of my favorite science fiction franchises ever. But you've just seen Stargate for the first time, right? So what's your takeaway?
Okay, so when I was getting into it, and you had a military crew going on this expedition, across this portal, I was a little bit concerned, mainly because of the movies that we've been watching recently, like Aliens and stuff like that. So I was concerned that I was in for more horror type movie, obviously not knowing what to expect going into this. So when it turned out to be like I wouldn't say like a fun adventure, but it was like a adventure into like this new world, discovering this new civilization, like knowing the people there, and like kind of uncovering the mystery that was going on there. It was very enjoyable. It was like, I wouldn't say like lighthearted, but it was like kind of like lighter in tone than what I was expecting when I was first kind of going into this. So on that sense, I actually really enjoyed it a lot. Like this thing that they do with traveling to cross dimensions and like going to this like alien world, and you're seeing people that are like essentially humans. I was like concerned about that aspect of it. I was like, okay, like we've gone all this way and like there isn't anything like super fantastical about the people that you're meeting here and this and the other. But I feel like the movie did a good job in terms of like explaining why they were there and like why they were like human-like, because essentially they were some of the humans that were transported into this planet. That aspect of it I quite enjoyed, and that's kind of like into some of the specifics. But overall, like the feel of it, it had like a really cool, interesting story. It had like some good character conflicts in there with the military leader in terms of like what his mission was compared to what the others were there for. It was a good introduction into this world. And I can imagine how more far-fetched it can get. But as like a starting point, as like an entry point into kind of the universe, it does a really good job opening you to this universe that can become more vast, because you've got, I can't remember, the guy was like a god, wasn't he? He was like, all
right, so he was an alien that had 3,000 years ago had come to Egypt, had possessed the body of this Egyptian boy, and at that point began impersonating the sun god Ra, and had essentially declared himself God Emperor, and used that authority essentially to enslave all of humanity, and kind of use them as the labor to build his interstellar empire using the Stargate. And so from that point on, he used humanity to kind of mine this mineral that the Stargate and all these technologies are made from, and he uses that to fly around the galaxy in a spaceship that looks like a gold-plated pyramid impersonating the sun god. And that's the idea.
Yeah.
So that leads into my first question, which is, this movie asks a lot of you to believe, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So at what point? So it starts out like a pretty tame, right? You've got Daniel Jackson, who is this, well, by the way, one of my favorite characters in all of fiction, but that's mostly because of what he turns into in the series. But I think he's great in this movie as well. But he's like this archaeologist who's kind of a crank, right? He's giving a lecture to an empty room about how the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, that they're older than everybody says they are, that the languages there are not human languages or not any known languages. And he's a complete crank. And then the Air Force shows up and says, hey, we'd like you to take a look at something. And they want him to translate the manual for a teleportation device that happens to be an ancient Egyptian. It was dug up in near the pyramids 100 years ago. So what was like you went into this not knowing a whole lot, right? So at what point was what was like your thought process over the first 20 minutes or so where they explain all of this, And was there ever any chance where you said, no, this is stupid, I'm not on board with this?
So initially, okay, so I wasn't super on board with the movie at this point, essentially, just because it was like a lot of like kind of like science mumbo jumbo type thing going on, and it was doing a lot of like explaining as to like sort of kind of like what things were, and like they were trying to do, and like trying to explain sort of like this link to this outer world. So as that was going on, I was a bit like, okay, I'm not really sure what we're sort of, I wouldn't say what direction we're going in, but I was like, okay, I understand that this is just the setup of it, and I wasn't super invested into sort of how they were setting it up, and like it's kind of like something that you've seen played out sort of a lot of times in like other movies where it's like, okay, like this is the premise, we need this person here and whatever, and they're like the one person that kind of like knows about sort of this or might have like some type of knowledge about this. So as that was going on, I was a bit like, okay, cool, like this is not formulaic because like this came out sort of way before sort of a lot of other movies I've done something similar to it, but I was a bit like, okay, like this is just kind of following the process and just kind of like setting things up, the base of like what's to come in the rest of the movie, essentially. So whilst it was like a lot, it was complex, I don't think I was like at that point, and especially because it comes like very, very early, as invested in the movie. So I'm not kind of like watching it at that point, I would say.
Was there ever a point where the movie was close to losing you? And if so, why wasn't it the gold-plated pyramid spaceship?
That was actually quite fun. I was like, at the very start, they do show the spaceship, and I was a bit like, okay, what's going on here? I don't think it was like in danger of losing me. I was a bit like, okay, like let's get to some what we're actually like here for, essentially. And yeah, no, I think by the time like they got to the portal and were like transporting themselves onto the other side of the portal, like I was like ready to kind of like see what comes next, essentially. So I wouldn't say it lost me. I was just kind of, I wouldn't say.
So for you, the movie started when they got to the planet.
For me, yeah. I would say that. Like everything that kind of like happened before that is just like the setup, essentially, and I'm just like wasn't as invested in that part of the movie.
So one of the things that this movie really leans into is wonder, right? Like this whole like discovery, like seeing what's out there, right? And the galaxy being, or the world being bigger and more fantastical than anybody would have thought, right? Now I've seen Stargate multiple times over, like the series, and so for me, the like this whole sequence with the gate being activated and the blue whirlpool and everything, that doesn't evoke wonder, that evokes nostalgia, right? Because I've seen this hundreds of times. They do this in every episode of the series and so on. What was your reaction to the gate activate, the first time the gate was activated? Like, did it do anything? Did you say, oh, this is cool? Did you just go, I wonder what's behind that? I wonder what happens next? Or is it like, can we get to the plot now? Like, what impact did it have on you?
No, genuinely, I was like, there was like the state of like wonder to like what they're about to encounter on the other side, and like, kind of like potential dangers they're going to be. And again, this is like a caveat of like us coming off of like October and watching like so many like kind of like horror movies and like Alien and like watching like Alien and stuff like that. So immediately in my mind is that like they're going to get to the other side and like it's not going to be good. Like they're going to have to sort of deal with some type of like alien being on the other side initially, just like as they get there, like kind of like try to survive this like harsh environment. And then so yeah, for me it was wonder mixed with a little bit of fear as to sort of what they're about to be sort of kind of like put through essentially on the other side.
And then on the other side is a desert and a pyramid, and there's just people there, and we have spent like at least half an hour just dealing with the local population.
Before we get to like the natives, what I like actually did enjoy was just like kind of like how they like set up to sort of first discovering the natives, and even like some of like their first interactions with sort of with the natives. Obviously, you have like this like massive like language barrier between the two, and like they're trying their best to find some type of like common ground and like some type of like understanding between the two of them. That I was like, okay, like this is like pretty cool. This is like very, very sort of interesting to see sort of how, if you were like kind of like put in that situation, like the sort of non-verbal communication that you would do to try and like show that you're like not a threat or you're like friendly and you're sort of not a danger to them, especially because I always think this is like when you've got like all of these like sort of military soldiers with their guns and this, that, and the other, it's like, well, it turns out like these people kind of knew what weaponry was, but it's like this like kind of like wonder as to do you know how like deadly like these military people can be with like their guns and stuff like that? So there's like a bit of like tension because obviously you don't know how some people react in look, well, you know how some people like react in that type of situation, and of course like the military people like kind of like taught to treat anything that's like unknown as like a threat and stuff like that. So I feel like that kind of like whole sequence was really, really interesting, really cool.
And I think one of the things that really balances out all the weird stuff is the human angle, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got the two main characters, Daniel Jackson and Jack O'Neill, right? I think that like those are really the core of the movie, like on a character level, right? And they really carry the movie. But then we have a bunch of different characters. We've got some of the soldiers get a bit of characterization, and there are multiple people among the locals that get a lot of screen time, right? And even though they only get a few, it may depend on what version you watched, but some of their lines are captioned and some aren't. So you don't really get much scenes, like much dialogue from them, because it's told from the point of view of the Americans who don't speak their language, right? But there are a couple of scenes where they talk to each other and that is subtitled. And I think the movie does a really good job kind of bringing those characters to life.
Yeah, no, I agree. Especially with the guy that obviously you had like kind of like the group of kids that were in there, and obviously like they were like super curious about was it Jack O'Neill, the military guy, or was he the other one? Yeah. Jack O'Neill, like they were like kind of like also like curious about him and like playing with fire and this and the other. And you had like one that was like a little bit like cheeky and stuff like that, tried to like kind of like pickpocket the archaeologists earlier when they were like walking them towards their encampment and stuff. At first, back to the subtitles thing. At first, I thought I was watching like a faulty version of the movie because I was like, surely this would be like captioned, but it actually like does make sense in terms of like it being portrayed from the perspective of the archaeologists and the military guys traveling into the world. So that was actually a good touch. So then when you actually do get the subtitles, once you're like a little bit more comfortable and more familiar with them, it did make sense in that sense. I did like the leader of the encampment as well. Like he was just like interesting in terms of his position in there as well. I will say the love story between the archaeologist and the girl was a bit like, I was a bit like, okay, like as soon as they showed her, I was like, okay, she's gonna fall in love with him, this and the other. It was a bit like kind of like typical, what you kind of expect from this type of movie, essentially. So
yeah,
it was.
That whole thing, I think, is the one part of it that has aged really badly, and that is that I kind of cringe through every time I watch it. Like once, like she shows him the inscriptions and everything, it has charm again, but everything before that is really uncomfortable.
Yeah. It didn't really make sense why she went to him as well, like that very first time, and kind of like stripped in front of him.
It was a distraction maneuver. So Ra banned writing in this culture, right? So that they wouldn't know their own history. And when Daniel starts, he's looking for the seventh symbol for the return address, right? That's the whole thing, right? And so he draws the symbols he knows from the gate. And Kasuf, the leader, freaks out because it's the big taboo, right? And he still doesn't he started to trust them, but he knows that this is trouble, right? And so he kind of sends him his daughter as a distraction.
Okay.
That's what's happening. But then they actually turn out to actually fall in love, and that's actually a plot point in the first season or so of the series. But yeah, it starts out quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the movie does a good job of just kind of humanizing some of the civilization as well. Because like again, you can like you've seen examples in movies where they kind of like gloss over some of the people within civilization, and you kind of like focus on like some of the higher level characters, and you don't like really get a sense of like what it's like actually like, or what it feels like to live in this encampment. And again, like I think the movie does, like you explained there with like the writing and stuff like that. Like the movie does a good job of kind of like putting like little clues or little hints out there as to why they are the way that they are, and like why like why they've come to be. And again, it kind of goes back to me saying that it was at first disappointing to know that they were like humans, because again, you've gone to a complete different world. You've gone to like an alien world, and you're just seeing people like that essentially the same as you. And maybe there could have been like a bit more of a reaction to it as from the archaeologists and the military guys, because you've gone through a portal and you're essentially just seeing other humans on the other side. Like you would have expected to see something different maybe, but no, it does a good job as to kind of like putting the pieces in there, kind of like hinting at why they are the way that they are, why sort of they have like their sort of their rules and stuff like that, and why they're sort of kind of afraid of certain things and why they kind of like embrace other things as well. So yeah, no, it's really, really sort of well done on that sense, and it does a good job of like getting you like emotionally invested in sort of some of these characters as well in those moments, I would say.
Any standouts?
Military guy, Jack O'Neill. I actually like, aside from like the camping team, like I just like, I don't know, he's kind of like no nonsense approach at certain times. I sort of know. I like his character development probably the most out of like everyone in this as well, in terms of sort of know what he was there to do, sort of know him sort of kind of like being on this mission and then having to sort of know get a little bit more comfortable and sort of know. I'm trying to find the best way to like explain it, but
I think he's really humanized by the loss of his son, right? Like when we first see him, he's about to commit suicide. Mm-hmm. Right? When the Air Force sends people over to his house to kind of tell him he's been reactivated, he's about to shoot himself. Mm-hmm. Did you pick up on that?
I might have missed that.
So his son shot himself with his sidearm. Okay. And as a result, he essentially retired from the Air Force and has been essentially depressed and has not lived his life since then. And he's about to shoot himself because of that, because he cannot live with the grief, with the loss, with the responsibility. And that is why he goes on the suicide mission, right? He thinks it's a one-way street. Any kind of danger he encounters on the other side of the gate amounts to stay behind and nuke it, right? So he is prepared to not come back, right? And then the first person he connects with is, I think Skara is pretty much the same age as his son, or not too far off. Like Skara basically worships O'Neill, right? Like he looks up to him. Like everything O'Neill does is amazing. It's the most impressive thing Skara has ever seen, right? And for a guy who's lost his son just a few years earlier, or not too long ago, like you can imagine what that feels like, right? Yeah. And then he kind of lets his guard down, and then the first thing Skara does is reach for O'Neill's gun again. Mm-hmm. And that's where he freaks out, and that's where the barriers come back up. This is like this silly movie about alien space gods and going to alien planets through an alien artifact that they found in Egypt. But I think it's actually got a really human core at its core, right? Because the whole story kind of hinges on or rests on what O'Neill is doing and why he does what he does and stuff like that. So it's not just this 2 hours of like space action. It's actually quite grounded in terms of what characters do.
Yeah, we've like mentioned it before, but that's what makes like the best stories is when you sort of have that human element to it, and you're able to sort of connect to the characters that are sort of in the story that's being told. And again, that's kind of like why I naturally gravitated towards O'Neill, was just because he had this story that was like kind of like unfolding with him, and sort of this like kind of like trauma that was within him that was like kind of again influencing sort of what was happening in the movie as well.
Yeah, and it's like it's got layers too, right? Like it's not simply a tragic backstory. It's also like this difference between Wonder and Discovery on the one hand, and he essentially going out to die, like at the same moment, right? Stuff like that. And this whole thing that he's essentially given up on people and himself, and now he needs to become this big hero to save the day, right? Like, I in my view, if you take that out, it's just like a schlocky sci-fi movie. But because they injected this humanity into it, not just with him, but the other characters too, but like his is probably the most compelling. I think everything just acquires a little bit of gravitas, right? And a little bit of humanity. I think we've had that in a bunch of movies where a movie kind of falls flat because there's like a human core missing. Like there's somebody at the center that kind of does something you can relate to, not necessarily relate to, but that you can feel for. Right, and you can go like that character goes on a journey and you're with them, and it doesn't matter really what circumstances in, but it just becomes more compelling if it's there.
No, I agree. It's that human element that keeps you sort of kind of like emotionally invested and kind of keeps you sort of on the ride of sort of the character. You can just see how it applies across sort of all types of stories that you're trying to tell.
And like the universal lesson is make me care about the character, and then I go anywhere with them. Mm-hmm. Right, like Jack O'Neill has like 10 more seasons of character development after this in the show, and like he ends up being like a pretty amazing character. Not entirely. And there's actually a running joke about how he's not quite the same person as in the movie, but it's like they keep taking those ideas to places, right? And like one of the big strengths of Stargate in general has always been that it asks you to accept really ludicrous things, but it makes you care about the people who are going through these ludicrous things, and because of that you're on board, and it works, right? Like when we talk about this the series, like we can talk about how they do that with multiple characters that haven't appeared in this, but it's just, I think that is how you do kind of sci-fi drama. It's like I'm all for like the big epic battles or whatever, and like if this movie was just them fighting the jackal guards in the pyramid, I would still like it, but I think it really becomes excellent at the point where we care about these people, right? Yeah. At this point, like when the locals start rebelling, like they rebel on their own, but they've been inspired by the protagonists, right? Because they've seen that that's another way, and that just people can actually do something and can be better or can be more than what they've been told they can be, right? So like at that point, like when Daniel has been captured and is supposed to execute the other soldier to prove like as a power move by Ra, right? And there's this big crowd of people who are supposed to watch. When the boys kind of break out the guns and start fighting back, I cared about that, even though I didn't know most of their names, right? Even though they haven't had dialogue. They made me care, and so when the cool thing happened, I cared. It was better.
Yeah, no, for sure. And when that kid died as well, it made you feel that as well, which is pretty bold. I will say, I didn't like the villain in this one too much.
What's that?
I think it was more the performance, if anything, and that could just be down to like the direction of the director, but just like the way that he carried himself, the way that he like spoke and stuff like that, I was just kind of cringing at it a little bit. It was like off, like it was like cringe in terms of like sort of what was sort of being delivered on screen. And we talked about sort of what makes a good villain in videos sort of ages ago, and he just didn't have anything that I was like looking for in a good villain. Like he wasn't he didn't have like that presence like on screen. Anytime he was on screen, I didn't really feel like his presence at all. His like dialogue was a bit like okay, whatever. It wasn't cutthroat or like super evil. I don't know. It just like there just was like something missing for me in that performance, and I just couldn't get behind it.
So is it just because he's like more of an archetype than a person?
Possibly, because he didn't seem human-like at all. Like when he was like,
he was a 3,000-year alien who has been pretending to be a god for all this time.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, you would like after like 3,000 years, 300 years, whatever, you would think that he would have understood how to communicate or how to like portray himself to be this deity or this being that he was impersonating. But I don't know. I could just never get behind it for whatever reason in this. Like it just fell flat for me.
Yeah,
and I know that's like a little bit like lazy to say, but it's just like sometimes you just like have that feeling. And any time he was on screen, I just never had the feeling that he was like a menacing presence or he was like this big threat that needed to be eliminated. It just like I just never had any of those feelings when watching it. I was a bit more like, can we skip to him not being on screen?
Yeah. So one thing I really enjoyed about him is that like as a person he's not interesting, right? He's just the bad guy. He's just the warlord. He's just the villain, right? But there's something really interesting going on where for thousands of years he has essentially been keeping people Stone Age is saying too much, but like he's been keeping them kind of suppressed, so to the point where they're not a threat, right? Like his security is basically like 6 guys with staff weapons, and they are all like he runs an entire society just on intimidation and putting on a good show, right? That's how his society works. This society it's not even really a society. It's more like a feudal lord like living on like an estate with like 10 servants or something like that, right? It's not really a society. And he, for the first time in thousands of years, as far as we know from this movie, he's encountering somebody who can actually threaten him. And you can see, like, one thing I really like about his performance is that his entire thing is that he's superhuman, he's untouchable, he's immortal, he's unbeatable, right? But when he realizes that something is happening, something has changed, you can see that he's a little bit afraid, but he still keeps his composure. But there's a change in how he talks, right? How he gives orders and how he talks to Daniel, for instance. And when he starts punishing the locals for having sheltered the soldiers, there is like just a little bit of fear in his response, right? It's because he's used to, like, his entire existence is predicated on being in complete control at all times, and now he's no longer in control. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to claim that Ra is interesting as a person, right? Because he isn't. He's not really a person. But I think this whole idea of like there's like a dictatorship, and dictatorships don't work by controlling everybody at all times. They work by creating a situation in which everybody thinks they're alone, right? So everything, like most of the villagers we see probably don't believe that Ra is a god, or they might or might not, or they might be unhappy with the situation, but they all believe they're alone, because Ra has created the situation in which it is so dangerous to even voice this that everybody thinks they're alone, right? Mm-hmm. And now something comes along that shows everybody that there's another way.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what we're seeing basically with Ra is like a dictator's reaction to the realization that there's a crack in his power. And I think that is interesting.
I hear it. I get it, but yeah, I just didn't get the feels for it during the movie. But like I don't understand like sort of like the concept behind it and sort of like the ideas behind kind of like showing someone that's sort of starting to lose some control over something that they had sort of over a very long time. It's just maybe it could have sort of been done in a little bit more sort of a entertaining or more engaging way. Yeah. To kind of like have me sort of be invested in sort of what was going on with him sort of throughout. But it does add like new context to when Daniel sort of first comes through the portal, and he's obviously wearing the necklace, and it's got some of the symbol on there as well. And then obviously like people like kind of like start bowing to him and stuff like that. It does like kind of like recontextualize sort of, that in terms of potentially sort of the local civilization maybe possibly looking to sort of turn to another god, or like turn to sort of something other than what they sort of already had, because sort of maybe like what they had.
At first they think they are messengers from Ra, and that's why they kneel, and that's why they initially like give them food and water and everything. And then but then when they are told, no, actually we are not, like we're not emissaries of Ra, we are somebody else, then people get curious, because they've never seen this before, right? It may be centuries since the last time they saw somebody who wasn't Ra, in terms of people from other worlds, right? So before we move on, one of the major characters we haven't talked about is Daniel Jackson. Any big thoughts on him?
He was cool. Like he was kind of like the vessel that we sort of saw the movie through, and he was like kind of like the character that we were sort of following through this journey with. I will say I don't think I was like again that invested. Yeah, and you're gonna like apply sort of kind of like new context to sort of his character for me. Obviously when you kind of go through this, but again he kind of had your typical kind of like protagonist journey in this for me, where he goes through this sort of this new world, falls in love with the girl, sort of like starts to sort of kind of like uncover. I mean, it was quite good in terms of like how like fearless he was for some obviously like someone over like his sort of background and stuff like that. But I don't think I was like that impressed with Daniel as the protagonist in this. And
I say that Daniel Jackson is one of my favorite characters in fiction that mostly comes from the series. What if I told you that at one point Daniel Jackson dies, goes to heaven, and is kicked out for being too good a person?
I was curious, because you were saying that like they sort of kind of like stretch what you sort of should believe in. So I didn't think it went that far. Okay, that's crazy.
Yeah. I'm embellishing a little bit, but that's basically what happens. It's like a season-long character arc. I think he does it twice, and it starts getting old after the third time. But he is like he gets basically reinvented for the series, and he's basically the main character of the series. But I think here, like you said, he's got this base, like very classical hero's journey, right? He starts out kind of at a low point. He's considered a crank in his profession. He is kind of insecure. He's nervous. He's allergic to travel. In a story that's all about traveling to distant places, right? And he's kind of a bit of a fraud, right? Because he's constantly lying to people because they wouldn't take him seriously otherwise, right? But then in the end, he ends up kind of standing up to a god, right?
It's cool. Like it's cool, but it's very formulaic type.
I think I agree that Jack is more interesting in this movie. But I think like Daniel also just really works, right? Because we are following his journey. I think what really helps that we, because he's a linguist and an archaeologist, like his entire thing is about finding things out and asking the right questions and trying to find answers. And that I think helps really with selling the basic story, like the plot of the story, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't say that he was like a negative for me in the movie at all. Like, not compared to like the villain in this. I wouldn't say that he was like a negative. He was just like in some movies, he was just there. He was just like the protagonist that we were following in this, and it wasn't like super invested. It wasn't like super negative and anything kind of like towards him. But I can understand why they would choose to recontextualize him in like maybe I don't know if it's reinvent. Maybe it's like it doesn't. I don't know how far it goes with changing up his character, but I do kind of like
it builds on what happens in this movie, right? So at the end of this movie, he stays behind. They seal the gate again, but he stays behind on the planet. When we watch the pilot of the series, basically that pilot starts with a year later, the gate gets opened again, and Daniel sending a message, right? So that kind of goes from there, and he becomes a really central character in like the plot of the series.
I didn't believe enough in his love story for him to stay behind. Like when he was like doing it, I was a bit like, I was like, okay, like that. It like I don't know why this person has made you feel like you want to stay behind in this alien world and give up everything that you have like back in your life on Earth. Stay behind in this
So he has been drummed out of his profession. He's considered a crank. He's literally lost everything, right? He says at one point at the very start, everything I own is in the suitcase, right? Yeah. So deciphering the Stargate is his one shot at accomplishing anything in life, right?
But you're accomplished
the movie, which I think is a really good foundation for a character place, right? Because you've taken everything from them away, and now they're at the lowest point, and now he can't just walk away, right? He has to succeed. But then by the end of it, he succeeds. And like one thing that's maybe not, I've never been entirely sold on, is that he wouldn't just start working. Like surely they would study the Stargate more, right? And surely they would like have use for the one person in the world who can like speak the language and stuff like that, right? So like him staying behind has never made the most sense to me, but comes from a place of that he has nothing to go back to in that sense.
Yeah, and I get the whole like he has nothing to go back to, but wouldn't that change now that he's like kind of like cracked the Stargate? Like when his status in his profession and that kind of like the work he's done, and even like how he's held by this government agency, that would like all change how he's perceived and like who he is in this world, maybe. But yeah,
I think it's more like the like this is where kind of the classic Hollywood tropes shine through, where like him staying there, having found love and purpose and everything, is just the Hollywood ending. And even if you can point towards things that he could do when he returns to Earth, like this is still like the Hollywood ending.
And it felt like it. You can read it. You can see it from a mile away.
One thing that takes up a lot of time in the movie is how where they go through the process of figuring out how the gate works and what they need to turn it on, what they need to get back, stuff like that. It's probably at least 30-40 minutes where they just talk about the 7 symbols and the final symbol for the point of origin and whatever. How did that come across to you, and at what point did you realize it was all nonsense?
How did that come across to me? It was
so they talk about this whole thing. Okay, there's 7, like you need 7 symbols to activate the gate, and 6 of them are points in space, and each symbol corresponds to a constellation, right? And 6 of them form 3 intersecting lines, so that's a point in space. And then the 7th symbol is the point of origin. And those 7 symbols together is the code with which you activate the Stargate.
Okay. No, I recall that. I mean, it was cool. It was interesting, like especially when they were kind of like drawing it up, like you were just saying there about like the point of origin, some of that. It was interesting, but I wasn't. See, like talking about this, it sounds like I didn't really enjoy the movie, but I did actually enjoy what was going on. But I don't know. I wouldn't say that I was like.
But it's like half an hour of the movie, right? Like
I know.
A lot of the movie is them talking about the symbols.
Yeah. Like, and as you're saying it, like I do remember like the parts of what you're talking about, and I do remember them going into like the undercover cave and stuff, or like the underground sort of place where like that, and it was like kind of like there's some symbols and stuff like that. But I don't remember. But yeah,
Did you just kind of sit through it, or was it actually engaging?
I think I just sat through it. Like based on me like not really like remembering too much, but I think I just kind of like sat through it, and it just kind of like maybe like went a little bit over my head.
What if I told you this is the first thing they retcon in the series? They completely throw it out.
Okay, fair enough. Fair. That makes sense. Because if it was meant to be like this massive point in this movie, then maybe it just took up like screen time for no reason, really. Because like I don't know. I don't like I felt nothing towards it, like negative or positive. I don't know. Why do you feel like they retconned it?
So because it makes no sense. So. Like, first question is, why does the destination need to be 6 points, but the point of origin be 1 point? For example, right? Why is it not 6 points each? Or why isn't just every planet a symbol or something, right? So it simply does not make any kind of logical sense, not least of all because the constellations kind of line up to make shapes from our point of view, right? So constellations are not things, right? They're optical illusions. So this entire thing makes no sense whatsoever. And when they spun it off into the series, they realized that this whole setup was very limiting because they needed a different planet every episode, right? So they essentially said, look, it's just an address. Like, it's just a seven-digit code. And if you punch in the right symbols in the right order and it corresponds to a Stargate, then you can go through. And that's it. And they do that like in the second episode or the first episode, and it just fixes it. Like, they never touched again. They expand on it a little bit in later series, but it's just they completely throw out this thing that the movie spent like a third of its runtime on, like, trying to justify. So whenever I watch this movie, I do roll my eyes a little bit because, like, you don't actually need to explain how this works. Like, we need to understand that we need to understand that it's a problem, and we need to understand that Jackson can solve it. But the actual story is not about that, right? Or if it is about the story, then give me something that makes sense, like on a very basic level. And they just spend all this time on something that makes no sense and is not important to the story. And if I could if somebody were to do an actual reboot of this movie, I would tell them just cut that part. Just have them say, we need to figure this out. And Jackson figures it out by translating the right thing in the right way. And then they can turn it on. That's all you need.
Yeah. That is true. That's all you need. You don't need to do a deep dive on the mechanics of it or like how it works and stuff like that.
If you do make the mechanics make sense, that's the other thing. Like, it's one of the two.
And interesting way. And doing it in an interesting way, because I don't know, that just went over my head.
I guess it doesn't really register as nonsense the first time you watch it, but I think I guarantee if you watch it a second time, you're gonna say, wait a second. Hold on. Like, I imagine that's the reaction you get when you watch it for the second time.
You know what? I think I treated it like how you were like kind of like saying there, in terms of like, this is a problem and he just needs to fix it. And I think I just like saw it like that, and I didn't really like kind of like take notice of like really like them trying to like explain the mechanics of like all or whatever. I just kind of like saw it as like a problem, and he's going to be the one to fix it, really. And again, maybe it just requires a second watch to truly understand that they were like trying to add this like really complex thing to it, and I was just like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. Anyway, it's just something that bothered me, and I wanted to complain about it on the internet. So moving on, I've talked quite a bit about the spin-off shows, right? And I think it's really notable that this kind of obscure, like, this movie was a success, right? This made about $200 million on a $55 million budget back in 1994, so it was a success. But I don't think this movie really has all that much cultural relevance. it's not mentioned. Like it's not typically mentioned. Like if people say, "Hey, what's a great science fiction movie I should watch?" Nobody says Stargate, right? Like you're not a sci-fi buff. You had never heard of Stargate before this, right? Is that right? And
That's
like,
right.
has anybody ever recommended this to you? Has anybody ever mentioned Stargate to you?
Never. I've never heard of this at all, ever. Like no reference of it at all. Not even like any of like the iconic like sort of characters in there and like that. I'd never come across it whatsoever.
And it's got cool images, right? It's like the Jekyll guards, right? Like these like Ra's personal guard with this tall armor using the Egyptian like iconography, mixing it with sci-fi aesthetics. I go on about the pyramid-shaped spaceship, but I think that's really cool. And there's a lot of that in the series. Also, like it just has this really distinctive aesthetic of mythology and antiquity and science fiction all kind of meshed together. And this whole idea of ancient astronauts, this idea that ancient cultures were contacted by aliens and were influenced by them, and the stories about gods are actually aliens, right? Like this is an idea that's out there, right? That has been for a long time. But for some reason, it's like Stargate does not seem to have any kind of big resonance with people.
I will say actually, I know you mentioned a few things that you thought were iconic. I didn't get the same feeling of it, of like any of like kind of like the imagery being iconic, even like the guards and stuff like that. At first I was like, okay, this is cool. I felt like they were kind of like alien like and stuff like that, but I didn't come away feeling like it was like, I don't know, like this like massive like kind of pop cultural like icon that like was like so. Maybe I'm the wrong person for that, because like most of the time I'm like not sort of that type of person.
It might be that there's no equivalent to a lightsaber or like the Star Trek uniform. So like there are certain images that even if you're not into science fiction, you still recognize it.
Yeah,
right? You can quote it, you can reference it. And Stargate, I think, doesn't really have that, right? Like to me, my lizard brain, whenever they turn, like somebody charges up a staff weapon, it makes this charging sound and this crackling sound. And I've heard that so, like hundreds and hundreds of times, that it just makes me feel warm and fuzzy, right? Like that sound, it's like this, like it's like the lightsaber being turned on, right?
Yeah.
And like that, like if you once you've heard something long enough and you have positive associations with it, it just feels familiar and it feels right. But nothing from Stargate, I think, ever carried over into the general population or like the general audiences in that way, right? Maybe that's why.
I think that's why. I generally feel like that's why, because there isn't, even going into it, like it's, for someone that hadn't watched Star Wars before, you know what to expect, or you know like some of like what you might see. Again with this,
you at least know the blaster sounds, and you know what it sounds like when a lightsaber gets turned on, right?
Yeah, and then with this, like there wasn't anything to particularly look out for, and I know you say about like the staff and stuff like that, and the noise that it makes, and I think that probably comes with like being sort of more invested in sort of in the franchise than obviously like someone that's watched it for the first time and has only seen it sort of first time this year. But I can't think of like anything that I could say was iconic in this at all. Like even sort of the setting of it or anything like that. Because like even with like Star Wars, you have like Tatooine and stuff like that. Like that's kind of like deemed to be iconic. But even like the settlement and like kind of like the desert place that they were in was just
it's kind of just Egypt, right?
Yeah, it didn't feel special. Like I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's like it didn't feel special at all, which is probably why. Even the whole design of the settlement, like so even like on like Tatooine or something like that, you kind of have like the igloo based sort of houses and stuff like that. Like that's something that's like a little bit different. And here, obviously, like the structure that we're in isn't the most common thing, but it isn't the most creative thing either that they sort of maybe could have done with it. Yeah, in my eyes.
And I think it's not trying to, right? At this point, they're just making a movie, and they're just saying, "Hey, what if the gods of Egypt were actually aliens?" Right? That's kind of the big what if, right? And they don't really need much else, right?
Yeah, no, and that's true. That's true.
So when I told you that this had like 20 years of spin-offs and multiple different TV shows, and there are sequels to this movie in production and whatever else, right? So I think by volume, it might be the third biggest science fiction franchise. Maybe like Halo might be bigger now, but it's like one of the big ones, right? If it's not top 3, then it's top 5 probably, just by like our like amount of stuff, right? So did that surprise you?
Yes and no. No, because again of like the wonder behind it and like how sort of, vast you can go into this. You've got this like device that can sort of kind of like teleport you from sort of Earth to an alien planet, and you can get like pretty wild with it. And granted they don't. And you maybe answer this, like if they haven't been stuck on the initial idea and they've been able to like kind of like expand it and like continue to kind of like build on mythology and sort of build on sort of the foundations of this and sort of kind of like tell a wide spanning sort of story and like sort of develop the characters even further and this and the other, maybe introduce new characters and stuff like that.
Before you continue, what if I told you that O'Neill's best friend is Thor?
Thor
period.
Yeah, okay, but then it makes sense, because if you're doing sort of the Greek mythology, then you have like the Norse mythology, you have like a huge range of things that you can like tap into. So again, it makes sense. And like what's funny is that like that's kind of like the God of War sort of franchise on the PlayStation game as well. Like it's just him going to kill a bunch of gods, and every time it's like a god from a different mythology. So I mean that's crazy. It's crazy, but it has that possibility behind it. And then when I say like, yes, it is surprising. So like that was like, no, it wasn't surprising, but like, yes, it is surprising because no one's heard of it. Like I haven't like even heard like any type of like inkling about this, and it's got like so much content out there. And like, I did enjoy this. And like you said that they're putting out some like other movies, and like I'll from sort of being introduced to this, I'll definitely check it out and like kind of like see what they do with it, especially knowing that there's like so much content behind it already. And I think one of the beauties of it is that because it's like not so like not well known, and they haven't got like these things that they have to like tie the franchise to, like again like your lightsabers, that they haven't got like the crowd, like the things that they have to like satisfy the crowds with. Or I don't know whether it has stuff that it needs to satisfy you with in terms of like some of like the sort of imaging and stuff like that. But because it doesn't have that, it's able to like just like go out there and just like be bold in like the story it wants to tell, and like kind of like be bold in terms of sort of the creative direction it wants to go with, essentially.
Yeah, it doesn't have this like entrenched idea of what it's supposed to be, right? Like there have been 3 spin-offs. 2 of them were well received, 1 of them not so much. And that last one was largely because like fans, like it wasn't so much about like the story or the characters or the world, it was about the tone. So the first 2 spin-offs are kind of very lighthearted action adventure. And then the third one was supposed to be very gritty, very dark, gritty drama kind of thing. And like a lot of people just didn't like it, and it didn't win over very many people. So, but it does not have this Star Wars, Star Trek problem of people have very specific and contradictory ideas. As in, like different people have different ideas of what Star Trek should be or Star Wars should be, and they're not compatible, right? Different people want very different things, and they're very adamant that it has to be this one thing, right? And I don't think that exists for Stargate, because there have been multiple shows, but it's kind of one story. And yeah, I think that's one of the big benefits. And there's actually another spin-off in development. I've not heard like this, but it's been in development for years, and I don't know how far along it is, but it's made by the same guy who started out back in 1996. So doesn't mean it's good, but it's not been like turned into an asset or like into a commodity yet, the way other shows have been. And that allows for good storytelling, and it allows for people to just tell a story they want to tell. And it might be good, might be bad, might find an audience, might not. But like it's in this weird position where it's large enough to be probably quite valuable, but small enough and obscure enough that it's not a low stakes. Mm-hmm. So on that basis, every time something new Stargate comes out, I'm saying, okay, this could be something. And if not, then no big deal. When you were like watching this, do you see you've kind of said this, but do you see the franchise potential? Or like watching it, did you say, oh, you could do so much with this, or I wonder like what the spin-off is like or whatever?
I mean, for sure. I mean, even like at the point, I know I said I didn't quite understand why Daniel would stay behind, but even at that point when he'd stayed behind or whatever, I was like, okay, like at some point you're gonna have to like communicate between where he is and like what Earth is, and he's gonna have time to really entrench himself into this like the new society that he's in and stuff like that, and like it can just like kind of like open up new possibilities, and sort of like, you know, what we saw was like maybe even like a small sort of section of sort of the planet that they were on, and obviously there's like a lot more that's sort of going on out there as well. So it was just like, yeah, there's definitely more story to be told, and sort of more sort of room for growth.
Before we close up, any other questions or thoughts about Stargate?
Has the story, like, and this is more like for in the future, like, has the story progressed past like Gary and like Daniel? Because like sometimes what I don't like is like being stuck in a certain time period with like the same characters and this and the other, and like, you know, and it was actually disappointing when you said that people didn't like the gritty and like kind of like darker version where it's like more like political sort of movie that they try to do in terms of spin-off. Because again, like my personal opinion is that when you've got like these like big franchises and like that's sort of kind of like stretching across sort of multiple universes and planets and mythologies and this and the other, is that there's like kind of like room for loads of different stories, loads of different characters to have like their moment, provided obviously like, you know, you're telling an interesting story and there's like actually a reason for the story that you're trying to tell. But I feel like there's room to do a lot of things in there. So I don't know, like is the story kind of like stuck on these set characters? You know, are the new characters introduced sort of kind of well established enough to kind of potentially like take over or something like that? Or like, I don't know, what, like how does the story develop across across the many years it's been going?
You want to know how it ends?
Why not?
By the end of season 10, the Ra civilization is destroyed, and the Asgard, the good aliens, are extinct, and humanity has earned the right to kind of the right to inherit all of their knowledge. And in the last 2 seasons, they fight an intergalactic war against these beings that have essentially become literal gods by through spiritual enlightenment, and siphon energy off from humans on a galactic scale. The Stargate Command fights a war against them and defeats them. And so that at the end of season 10, Earth is the only galactic superpower remaining. That's how Stargate ends. Cool. Are you interested?
I mean, yeah, it sounds like it gets crazy. It sounds like it gets very crazy. Yeah.
Like the first spin-off is Atlantis, where they find Atlantis in another galaxy. Second spin-off is they go to another galactic cluster where the gate builders have an automated gate building ship that goes to planets that have never been visited before to kind of build gates there and connect them back to the network. And so an expedition gets stranded on that ship because they can't go back, because they don't have enough energy. And so they kind of go off into a different galaxy, essentially discovering things that nobody has never seen before, including the gate builders who went extinct a million years ago. That's the second spin-off.
Yeah, I mean that sounds interesting. Yeah,
that last one didn't quite land. It didn't quite stick the landing, but that's essentially where Stargate goes. So it is not simply fighting dudes in pyramids for 20 seasons.
Yeah, no, perfect. No, it sounds very interesting. It sounds like it sounds like good sci-fi, I would say.
It is like that's part of why it's one of my favorite sci-fi franchises ever. And it started here, right? It's this fairly small movie, right?
Grounded,
like that's kind of derivative, right? Like nothing in this is new.
I saw it, so I said Desert Planet all over again. I was like Dune, Star Wars, all the same things.
I mean this whole thing about aliens built the pyramids. It's not a new idea. And they just say, what if that actually happened? Right? And then they went with it and they made a movie about it. And then it turned into this giant thing that kind of went to other places. So I think it's a really cool movie just on its own. And then there's like 20 more seasons of stuff and story that actually is, for the most part, really good. So I think we need to wrap it up now. But that's been our discussion of Stargate.
If you reach this part of the video, of course, you've heard our wonderful takes about Stargate and why it's this brilliant franchise that more people should probably know about. But do let us know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Have you seen it before? Is this one of your favorite franchises of all time? And of course, we'd love for you to be part of the community. So make sure to comment below. And of course, tell a friend to tell a friend and help us grow. Thank you very much. Ciao.
Bye-bye.